Hi, my name is Leah Day, and welcome to Quilt Along number 11 on the Free Motion Quilting Project. Last week we got started working on this heart and feather whole cloth quilt. And this quilt is going to be kind of a multi-step process. Last week we worked on getting our pattern together and marking the design on the surface of the quilt. Of course, there are a lot of questions, and one of the major things is on the pattern is a line, a square around the whole quilt. That is not the size of the quilt. The quilt does not have to finish at 15.5 inches. This particular quilt finished at 16 inches, but you can make it bigger if you want to. If you want to do a little bit more stippling and make it 18 or 20 inches, that's perfectly fine. You'll want to probably start with at least a 20-inch piece of fabric and backing and batting, obviously. So whenever you go to mark, you're going to center that right in the center. The other lines on the pattern, we get a lot of questions about that. The other lines were mostly to put the pattern pieces together to help you be able to line everything up when you're taping the pattern together. If you want to mark those diagonal and horizontal lines, you can, but it's not necessary to mark those on the quilt. When you work on a bigger whole cloth, anything really bigger than 15 inches, when you work on a bigger whole cloth, typically you'll take your fabric and fold it in half and press a crease, and fold it in half the other way and press a crease. You can also fold it on the diagonals as well, and this helps you line up the fabric with the quilt pattern, because often the bigger you get, the more you'll have to reposition the quilt top through the marking process. There's a limit to how big light boxes can be and how big tracing paper and all that kind of stuff can be. So whenever you get bigger with this, those diagonal and horizontal lines, registration lines, will become very, very useful for you. That's just a quick tip as far as that marking process goes. So this week we're actually going to be concentrating on stitching all of the lines. All of the lines that we marked last week, we're going to be stitching on those lines this week. And the first step of this process is to see kind of a game plan, form a game plan, how we're going to work around each motif, so you don't end up having to travel stitch repeatedly over the same area. And it's a really good idea to take your pattern and spend a little time tracing it with a pencil. It can be a pencil without any lead in it, so you don't make marks on your pattern. But just spend some time tracing it so you kind of get in your head how you're going to move when you're actually quilting the real quilt. And this is going to translate over and be really, really helpful, because then you won't end up repeating yourself a whole lot, stitching over the same area, wasting time, and then also potentially making mistakes if you accidentally stitch off the line. Of course, we're doing outline quilting, and this is challenging. The best tip I have is to go slow and keep your hands closer to the needle. Another fact is you're going to have to do a lot of travel stitching. There's absolutely no way to quilt on a line these particular motifs without doing at least a little bit of travel stitching. And the best advice there is try and make sure you rotate the quilt so that you see where you're stitching, and that you're always kind of moving towards yourself so that you can see where you're going next. And then of course work slowly, keep your hands close to that needle, and maintain control. At any point in time, stop. Stop and take a break. Breathe. All of those things are really helpful because oftentimes that's one of those things that we get so tense and so, caught up with all the stress of staying on the line that you start making more mistakes because of all that tension. So the first thing that I really want to kind of teach is how I'm going to move around each motif. I actually take my original pattern and a pencil, and I spend some time tracing that pattern just to get an idea of how I'm going to move in the real quilt. So let's watch that first and get an idea of how things are going to go, and then see how it's actually quilted on the machine. So we're going to get started in the middle motif of the quilt and start by stitching around that first heart, then across that middle, and then bounce around that top heart, hit that starting point, and then bounce around that third heart. Then you're going to travel stitch through the middle, bounce around that last heart, and then you can make up your mind how you want to tackle those inner hearts. You can draw a straight line, draw a curvy line, whatever you want to do in order to connect those, or you can break thread between each one of them. Whatever way you do, just stitch around it, and then that motif will be completely finished. So let's get started quilting this motif. The first thing to keep in mind is that this video has been edited to double normal speed, simply because I'm trying to show you a lot of things and I don't have time for it all. So the first step is to stitch down the straight line, and keep in mind that you can stop in many places on this heart. You don't have to just stitch without stopping. Stopping right between those two hearts is a great place, and then also in that little indentation where the heart is formed, that's also a good place to stop too. Now, of course, you can't stitch where you can't see, and I can't see where I'm going back here, so it's really important to rotate the quilt and always be able to see exactly where you're stitching next. So I'm going to stitch around the second heart, and again, when you can't see where you're going, you can't stitch it. So I'm going to rotate. I've gotten rid of that pen and that cut, and also hid my thread, so that way I could bounce, hit that point, bounce again around, hit that starting point very carefully, and then bounce around this third heart. And I hope that this makes a little bit more sense, having seen kind of me tracing the pattern so you know where I'm at. Now I have a lot of travel stitching to do to get right across this motif to the other side. So I'm going to keep this part of my finger parallel with my foot, and I'm actually using that part of my finger to kind of guide the foot, and that keeps it nice and straight, because the side of your index finger is generally a straight line. So if you keep that parallel, then generally your foot will stay straight on the surface of your quilt. So that finishes up the outline of the center motif. Now I decided to connect those inner hearts with a straight line. So I'm just going to stitch into the center, stitch a straight line to that heart, come around, staying right on the line. And if I was really quilting this, if I was going to finish it with stippling, I would go on ahead and fill that heart, that little heart, with stippling. I'm only showing you the outline here, so I didn't do that, of course. Now let's talk about the inner border of the kind of interlocking square. This is what we're going to do. We're going to stitch down on the inner, come inside, and then bounce across, doing some travel stitching, and basically repeat that exact same pattern all the way around. You're going to repeat that pattern 8 times as you go around the inner square. So let's see this stitched. I'm going to pull up my thread again. I did take the time to stop and hide my threads for the last motif, so that way they're out of my way. Now I'm going to stitch straight down, again using my index finger to keep that straight line straight. You know, it's one thing to mark it on your quilt straight, it's another thing to stitch it straight. So using your hands as a guide is a really useful way of keeping the line perfectly straight. And notice how I'm rotating every single time I change directions. I'm rotating even for that little itsy bitsy bit of travel stitching right there whenever I hop to the inside of that line. I'm doing that because I cannot see very well. Of course, my marks didn't show up all that great on this fabric. That's part of it, but it's also because it's just simply easier to stitch straight down towards me. That's how the machine really likes to stitch straight lines. It's easier. It helps. My hands are kind of a guide, so it works really, really well. So now let's talk about the outer lines. You're going to pretty much end right here and then just start working the outer lines. You got to do a little bit of travel stitching right there, come down and around and then back in, and that's all you're going to do all the way around that outer square. And you're going to do that 8 times as you work your way around it. So let's see how that's stitched. Now I ended right here, so instead of breaking thread, I'm just going to travel stitch through that little section and then come down around that outer line. And there's really just 2 sections to these interlocking squares. You do the inner section first and then the outer section. And while it might seem a little overwhelming, spend some time tracing it, and I think you'll get the idea of how this is going to work. You just come down, do a little bit of kind of bounce back, and then travel stitch forward, trying to keep that line as straight as you can, then rotate and come down towards you. Now let's talk about the feathers. You're going to stitch that vine, and then this is my preferred way of doing feathers, and that is to bounce against the vine. I'm going to come down, bounce, travel stitch, and come back up. Bouncing always against the vine, so the travel stitching is always on the back of the feather. Now this gets awkward when you stitch them kind of at this other angle. So you can stitch it this way, maintaining that same direction, or I'm going to show you, I just simply rotated the entire quilt. So here you go. We're going to stitch the vine first, all the way down between the hearts. And those corner heart motifs are just stitched the exact same way as the center. So don't worry about not knowing how to stitch those. They're exactly the same as the center. So now I'm going to come around that first feather, hit that vine line, and then travel stitch up and swing around for the next feather. Hit the vine again and swing up for the next feather. I like this form of feather simply because the travel stitching is always in the same place. It's always in this space between each feather, and I think it looks better that way. So now I'm going to rotate the whole quilt just so I can see where I'm going, and because the angle feels a little bit more natural, I'm going to stitch down that vine all the way to the beginning and then bounce and create that first feather, bounce off the vine and create the next. It really, with feathers, you've got to go with what feels most natural for you. And I really struggled to quilt those feathers in that awkward angle. So that's why I rotated it. And I think it's really important for you to see that. You can't always force yourself to stitch in a certain direction, and you shouldn't try to. So let's talk about another way of forming feathers. This is the bump bump feather method. You're going to form your first feather the same way, but now you're going to travel stitch along the vine. And then you're going to come up, bump against the first, bump to hit the second, and then come up and around. Then you're going to travel stitch along the vine, and then bump, bump, and bump around that last feather. And admittedly, this is a little easier to work in that awkward angle. You can see you just bump forward and then come back in order to form those feathers. So let's see how that works. And come down. I'm going to travel stitch along that heart and swing around with that first feather. Now travel stitch along the vine and come up and around and bump against that first feather with my second feather, travel stitch along the top, and then bump out for the third feather. Travel along the vine, come around and bump, then bump again to form the next feather. So that's the bump bump feather method. It's kind of funny, but it definitely does work, and you can see it's a little easier here. You just bump forward, then travel along the vine, then come around, and you really are going to depend on your markings for that to get accurate placement. You're going to depend more than anything else on having a good accurate mark so you can see where you're going, and then that finishes it up. So that's it for this week. I really hope you'll get into your sewing room and give this a try. It is challenging. That's a simple fact, and I can't deny it. But I also promise that if you try it and you give it your best, you will get better and see improvement by the end of stitching out all the lines on your whole cloth. You will also master an extremely important technique for free motion quilting, travel stitching. This is something that really will open so many new designs and so many new patterns and so many new things that you can do in free motion. And it's one of those things that you just have to kind of bite the bullet and learn how to do. If you find yourself struggling with breaking thread, try switching to a thinner, stronger thread. I'm using polyester isocord thread, and I swear this is my absolute favorite because I can travel stitch 3 or 4, sometimes even 6 times. If I'm really pushing it, I can travel stitch that many times over the exact same spot and not break thread. Oftentimes, if I travel stitch with something weaker and thicker, like cotton thread, the thread will immediately break, and it's very, very frustrating. So definitely try that if your thread's breaking a lot whenever you try stitching on a line. So that's it for this week. I really hope you'll link up your progress from last week. Ask any questions that you had about marking your whole cloth or free motion quilting in general. Next week, we're going to take this whole cloth and learn micro stippling and fill it on a teensy tiny scale so that all of those motifs pop out and really look wonderful on the surface. So definitely join us for that, and catch up on any other quilt along videos at freemotionproject.com.